Should you read Pindar? Pindar, for those of you who don't know, is an ancient Greek poet. He is considered by both ancient and modern accounts, scholars, people, maybe not people today, to be one of the most famous, greatest, and most foundational poets in Greek literature. Not as foundational as Homer, not as foundational as Hesiod, but he's definitely in that second tier. He's definitely in that non-legendary, semi-mythical tier. Pindar really is an interesting poet. So, let's give a sort of, well, not let's. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background information, just enough to get you guys kind of understanding the context in which he's composing a lot of these poems in. So Pindar was born around the city of Thebes, and his career kind of took up the first few decades of the 5th century. Now, the first few decades of the 5th century in ancient Greece were chaotic. You had two wars with the Persian Empire, in which both times they invaded. And the second one, they really tore stuff up in ancient Greece. And, his home city, not really his home city because he's not from the city itself, he's from the surrounding area, took the Persian side during the war. And when the Persians lost, the the other Greeks were not too happy with them. So, we already have a situation like this, and so the result is that Pindar kind of doesn't really have any sort of pro-Theban leaning in his poems, which causes him to kind of become this sort of poet of all of Greece. He writes about poems for many different families, many different figures, many different places throughout the entirety of the Greek world. Not just Greece itself, but we're talking about cities in Sicily, for example, in southern Italy, where there's a lot of Greek colonies. We're talking about northern Africa, where there's a couple of Greek colonies. Asia Minor, southern Thrace, a whole bunch of different places. Pindar has also a very diverse catalog, I think, which is another thing that differentiates him from a lot of other Greek poets. Not all of them, but among like the most famous ones, again, talking about Hesiod, Homer, Sappho, he definitely has this huge catalog, and a huge catalog that survives too. He writes about a lot of different things. He writes about gods, honoring gods. He writes about like temples and places and stuff like that. But what comes down to us and what makes up about a quarter of his catalog, the whole quarter, all of which mostly survives, are his poems dedicated to the winners of sporting events. That's right, Pindar wrote poems about sports, ancient Greek sports. Now, obviously, your first thought when you hear ancient Greek sports goes to the Olympics. And yes, the Olympics, the biggest, most famous sort of sporting event in ancient Greece, so famous that we still have Olympics. Now, there's obviously a bit of a gap, but that's besides the point. Gap in years that the Olympics are held, but that's besides the point. And you also have other major Greek games too that, while weren't as famous or as kind of impressive, still super, super, kind of respected games. The Nemean games, the Pythian games, and the Isthmian games round out the four major sporting events to the ancient Greeks. And so that is what makes up the bulk of Pindar's work. Um, and now to kind of set further the stage of my review, it's worth going over the kind of composition of these works. There is a kind of formula that Pindar kind of uses for all these poems. It's always like introduction sort of thing, introducing the person, and all these poems are dedicated to a person. Um, Introducing the person or introducing the event that the person won or both. Then he compares this event, this accomplishment, to an ancient Greek myth. And then he concludes the poem going back to the person and just giving a final kind of verdict on, how awesome this person is, or how awesome this achievement is that this person won this particular event. Um, and sprinkled in through some of these are also Pindar's references to himself, how he's going to try to honor this person as best as he can, and he'll invoke the muses here and there, which is like kind of ancient Greek poetry 101. You want to ask the muses for inspiration, stuff like that. And so I'm going to explain further the ancient mythical thing just a little bit. The myths he invokes are kind of done in an attempt to kind of put the victory, the kind of achievement, in a sort of context. He kind of does it pretty much in this, your victory in the chariot race. Let's just use chariot race for example. Your victory in the chariot race is just like this thing that Heracles did. What you did just now, or a couple days ago, whatever, is to us like when Heracles killed the giant Antaeus, for example. A story that shows up in a few of these poems. So that's the formula. And in terms of the meter, because he does write in a meter, he writes in a very weird hybrid meter that is super complicated to kind of figure out. And his language in general is also super complicated to figure out. And he'll do really weird stuff that makes his poetry like notoriously hard to translate. Like if you translate a Pindar and you do it well, you officially know you're ancient Greek. And you're also insane because it is like it can be very torturous at times. When my education is all said and done, I really wonder if I would even touch translating Pindar because it's really hard. And that kind of segues into my review because this really hard language does work its way into the translation because, again, if you're translating this, you want to do it to the best you can, but we're talking about super complex language, and I think that might lose a lot of people because a lot of people who aren't, reading stuff from this time period will really get tripped up by the like ridiculous kind of language that he employed here. And his poems can also be really dry because he repeats a lot of stories. And of course, you have the formula itself. Those are two really big critiques. In terms of repetition, he really goes to the same well of stories for most of I would argue, based off what I've read, most of these poems. A lot of stories about Heracles, a lot of the same stories about Heracles, a lot of the same stories about guys like Peleus, Telamon, Jason, um, a couple of Achilles stories, stuff like that. Honestly, I can't really think of any other story. There are other stories, don't get me wrong, but um, you know, that's pretty much what we have here. Now, with that being said, though, um, I would still recommend these poems, and the simple reason why I would is because you don't have to read all of them. Uh, if you're like a casual, like ancient Greek mythology fan, or like, anything like that, you could honestly just read his Olympic odes and leave it at that, because once you read a couple of them, you really get the full experience, and the experience is a good one. He tells a lot of interesting stories, interesting mythological stories in these that I think, obviously, with Greek mythology being still relevant in the cultural, our like cultural conscious, I think a lot of people will get a lot out of these stories. He again talks about Heracles, super famous figure even today, sort of an idealistic figure, and a lot of his labors are like some of the most famous stories of all time. Super entertaining too. And again, all those other heroes that I mentioned are super popular, some more than others, obviously, but some really interesting stories, some really interesting exploits and stuff like that. And conversely, you also learn a lot about these kind of sporting events, which I think will also draw our interest because again, a lot of these events are still held today. You're talking about track races, you're talking about horse races, which aren't part of the Olympics, but still, um, stuff like that. So I think there is a lot to gain from Pindar. Uh, so to kind of give a final verdict, I would recommend Pindar. You don't have to read all of it. It does get really repetitive. I enjoyed the whole thing, and if you're a classicist, I think you'll enjoy the whole thing too. If you are a classicist, if you are like a classics major like I am, or anything like that, or you are a classicist as in that's your career, I do think Pindar is foundational stuff, because I think he kind of his influence is too large on Greek poetry for you to ignore. I think reading him gives you a really deep understanding about everyone after him and their styles and stuff like that, and where they're coming from. And obviously, he's not the only foundational Greek poet. I mean, my goodness, you have Hesiod and Homer and stuff like that. They're obviously number one, but he's in that conversation, and I think he's a big part of that too. Uh, and if you're more a casual fan of like these ancient Greek history or ancient Greek mythology, I think there's still a lot here. As I already mentioned, the stories and learning about these kind of athletic events too. He doesn't actually go into a super great amount of detail about these events, but if you're reading a good edition of Pindar, the translator or the editor or whoever will fill you in on what happens in these events, and they're super interesting. My personal favorite is the race. I believe it's 200 meters of a running race where you wear a helmet and a shield, so you're like weighed down and you're running with these things. And I can only imagine just how you know just how weird that is. We really don't have a modern equivalent either of wearing weights to run in like an official race. Not officially anyway, not an official sport. So yeah, would recommend Pindar. Get a good edition. I would recommend Loeb. Now, Loeb, if you don't know about this series, they're made for classicists. They're made to be kind of companions to the Greek texts. Um, I would recommend the Loeb edition to you, because, again, the translator does fill in those gaps about what these sporting events were like. And it's also the only edition I've read so far. Um, so yeah, read that, or if you can find a edition with like a good sized introduction and some endnotes or textual notes, that's probably a safe bet too. Um, and like I said, you'll get a lot out of it. I would also One final recommendation is if you are like a poetry, like you're interested in the history of poetry, I think there's a lot here for you as well. You can kind of see like the development of the meter, um, the development of like the way poems are put together too from like a thematic standpoint. Uh, bunch of good stuff for you here as well. Again, don't have to read them all. But yeah, a lot of good stuff. So if any of you have read Pindar, you can tell me what you thought in the comments. And if you have any suggestions for future reading, classical related, because that's the theme of this channel, you can also put that in the comments. I would recommend that you like this video if you thought my kind of review was helpful. And I think you might want to consider subscribing as well, because this, if you're interested in these kind of topics, you should probably subscribe, because that's what this channel is going to be. Other than that, I think I will say good night. Good night.